Hi, my name is Ellie Gettinger. I'm Education Director at Jewish Museum Milwaukee. And today, for this museum moment, we're going to explore some elements of Milwaukee scrap. And actually, one of the things that I want to talk about with Milwaukee scrap is that, we did an extensive amount of research for this exhibit. The exhibit primarily came in from the Jewish Museum of Maryland, where they spent 4 years researching the topic and developing the themes. And then we started talking to our scrap community here about all sorts of things, how their families evolved and developed, how the business has changed, who was involved, what were the ways in which the business grew, what were the ways in which the business was challenged. And in these conversations with this amazing group of individuals, some of whom had been in the business themselves, some of whose parents or grandparents had been in the business, we were able to kind of come up with a kind of a general schema of scrap in Wisconsin. But knowing that even with, the interviews that we did, and I think we did about 10 or so, kind of extensive hours long discussions with people in the scrap industry, that we would never be able to touch all of the varied people that were part of this industry. And so I wanted to highlight some of the things that came out of these interviews and some of the stories that I really loved as we were developing this exhibit. So let's start with one of my favorites. And I think that really shows the kind of element of how scrap yards develop. So this is the Miller family. And the Miller family is the originator of Miller Compressing. We'll probably talk a little bit more about them later, but Miller Compressing was the largest scrap business in Milwaukee for many, many, many years. But in this picture, seated in the middle is Coleman Miller. Coleman Miller and his wife, Yusbeh, both had their own businesses. She ran kind of a fish market out of their house, and he had a scrapyard and peddling business in their backyard. So it really was the sort of thing that everyone in the family was exposed to, the business, to the work, to all of these pieces. Within this one family, there are 4 different scrapyards that come out of it. So the 2 sons, Maury and Herman, opened their own yard. And they separate from Coleman's yard in the back of their house. Anna, the girl who's seated to his left, she ends up marrying Louis Paley, who takes over Coleman's yard that is in the back of the house, and the other seated daughter marries Zeke Abrams, and so that's yet another. The Abram brothers is another scrapyard that we'll talk about later in this museum moment, but it really is the sort of thing that this one family had 4 different yards. Now, Herman and Maury worked together for many, many years, but then at some point they had a difference of opinion about the way the work was going to go. And so they split up the yard. And then so that becomes Miller Brothers on one hand and Miller Compressing on the other. Miller Compressing bought out Miller Brothers in the 1960s under the leadership of Maury's son, Bob. So you've got this kind of generational aspect that's already being showcased here, and you've got one family that has all of these different connections to many other large scrap businesses in town. So it's not just this question of personal investment or your professional arena. Your professional arena was often butting against your brother, your sister, your cousins. And it was highly competitive. It was a highly competitive commodity that people are dealing in. Let's look at what Coleman Miller's yard looked like. This is it. Just imagine, with zoning and all of those issues today, it's hard to imagine that this would be in a backyard, but this was in a backyard of a residential neighborhood. This was, I believe, like Fleet and on Fleet Street. You can just imagine, this is the sort of thing that you just throw this stuff in the backyard and then you process it and you sell it back. Anna, his daughter, described this as following, and we got this from one of our oral histories. This came to us from Phil Paley, who worked for many years for Miller Compressing, but is a grandson of Coleman Miller. And he shares that my mother always tells the story that part of her pleasure was that she would go peddling with her father. They would leave in the morning with the horse and wagon, pack a lunch, and then they would drive out to Waukesha. They'd pedal, and then when it was already dark, they took any scrap they had and they would throw it in the backyard. And that was somehow how the scrap business started. So this was their start on scrap, which is kind of this crazy story here. But we think it's just a really great addition. And you really do have this vision of the family going out in a horse and wagon. You know, it draws a great picture, but also because of this picture from 1903 that you do really get a sense of, you know, throwing things in the backyard. And then the whole family really probably had to be involved in processing and breaking this down. I personally loved the story of the Jewish Peddlers Organization, or the Wisconsin Salvage Collectors Union, which I think you think of scrap junkmen, scrappers being highly individual, but there was still this kind of collective force between them. Many of them were immigrants, many of them had come from the same universe. And so in the 1930s, during the Depression, they organized a union, or it's more of like kind of a guild, so that people, as they're calling, they have one kind of central address to say, hey, I need stuff picked up. And then this is then divided up by district. But it also meant that they had some collective power and engagement. This wallet belonged to Max Chudnow, who was the longtime president of the Wisconsin Salvage Collectors Union. His son, Avram, was their attorney. Avram described a fabulous case in the 1940s in which there was a scrapper who was in his 90s who was trying to ensure that his new bride in her 70s was getting a blood test. She didn't want to get a blood test before they got married. His first wife had died, and he really wanted to ensure that this next wife was going to have a nice long life. So there's, as one of the Chudnow sons reported back to me, this kind of sense of optimism that even this guy in his 90s, after years and years of toil and scrapping, was still able to say, hey, I'm getting married and it's going to be for a long time. I need to make sure this bride's going to make it. But yeah, this is a picture from our collection of the Wisconsin Salvage Collectors Union. And some of the people, I know that Marlon Brick looked at this picture and was able to pull out her grandfather. So if anybody else recognizes someone in this picture, please send us the name and let us know. We're trying to identify more of the people. World War II leads to a big transition in the way junk peddling or scrap is seen. Junk had kind of had this bad impression, this way of, you know, being looked at as something that was dirty and maybe suspicious a little bit, that they weren't always trusted. And all of a sudden with the World War II, there's this increased need for metal, paper, rag, you name it, we need it. And now, as opposed to being part of this kind of questionable economy, this is part of the war effort. Junk collectors are key men in the salvage drive for war effort. And they're, again, predominantly Jewish. We've had a lecture from Jonathan Pollock. He said, in the 1930s, 88% of Milwaukee's scrappers were Jewish. So, I mean, this is a predominantly Jewish field. And you get all sorts of pushes from the country. Max Chudnow says he's, you know, going to make millions of bullets out of the metal he's collecting. And this is a letter that is from the scrap district chief, the district salvage chief in Madison, March 23rd, 1944. So World War II is blazing, and he's sending it to the City Council of Watertown. In this, he's really pushing the City Council, who has been holding back on reissuing a license for Loeb Salvage, which is in Watertown. And he, in this letter, Mr. M.L. Shearer of Madison says, we are fully aware of the laws governing scrap yards, locations, fences, etc. However, in a time of war where materials of this kind are so critical, these regulations are being overlooked. The writer is familiar with the situation in the city of Watertown and the surrounding territory, and outside Miller Auto Parts Company, who are not too active, and the Riverside Salvage Company, who deal principally in wrecked automobiles. There is no dealer in that vicinity picking up scrap material for our war effort. Paper, especially, is very critical at this time. We might suggest that you determine what amount of waste paper is being produced by Watertown and turned into our war effort. If you do not feel that you should grant a license for all time to Mr. Loeb, permit us to suggest, gentlemen, that you at least grant this license for the duration and 6 months, which will permit this man to operate along the lines which are necessary in order to produce your full share of scrap material for the war effort. If they are not renewing this license, there is no way Watertown is going to be able to fulfill their part of the home front mobilization. They aren't going to produce the amount of paper that's needed. And it really is this sense of urgency and imperative. One of my favorite artifacts in the exhibit is a board game that was produced by Milton Bradley in the 1940s called Get Into the Scrap, which is a board game about scrap, which I think is just phenomenal. And hopefully someday I'll get the opportunity to play it. There's some big personalities that came out throughout our interviews. So many different people and so many different organizations and people with kind of noticeable traits. I know there was a guy named Tiny who was enormous. There were sons and fathers and wives and sisters who were involved in the industry. I wanted to point out this guy with the cigar. His name is Zeke Abrams, and he was this kind of larger than life personality. He actually married one of the Miller daughters, and he just was this kind of huge character within the world of scrap. Certainly ran his business, and took what had been a small business between himself and his brothers, and grew it to a very large business in Milwaukee. Abrams was born in Sheboygan and was part of his parents were Russian immigrants. They changed the name from Afromowitz, I believe, to Abrams. And they were toughs in Sheboygan. They walked into a bar and they heard someone saying something anti-Semitic. And I believe it's my understanding of this story from Zeke's son-in-law, Jack Beck, is that he beat the guy up. He said, he took him to task for his anti-Semitism. And he was kind of this figure. So in the 1970s, when the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries is doing kind of a retrospective and looking at scrap nationally, they invited 10 scrappers from across the country to come together. And he was one of the people that they interviewed for this forum. So we actually have some lovely video footage of Zeke Abrams. It's on VHS. Hopefully before the exhibit ends, we will have it digitized and be able to share that video with everybody via YouTube, because we're really excited about that. And you definitely get a sense from that video of his personality and his pointing and the cigar. It's all there. But we love being able to kind of capture some part of that just with a picture as well. Also working at Abrams, this is actually a picture of Abrams at a company function. You can see Zeke Abrams kind of lingering in the background in a larger than life photo there. And this is a group of people who worked at Abrams. The one I want to point out is this guy on the end, who is smiling, and you see his face in that crowd and you're like, oh, who is that guy? This guy was not just a scrapper, although he was the longtime director of PR or vice president of PR for Abrams Brothers. He also was a Green Bay Packer. This guy is Buckets Goldenberg. He was a Jewish guy who grew up in Milwaukee, went to Washington High School. Someday we'd have to do a museum moment about Buckets Goldenberg because there's a great story there. After he retired from the Packers, he went into the restaurant business and found that he was using scrap to supplement his income in the restaurant business, and actually not just to supplement the restaurant business, but to keep the restaurant afloat, that he was selling scrap and sorting scrap and working in the yard. He then leaves the restaurant business because he's in these two other careers where there's a huge amount of instability, between injuries or the market in the restaurant business, and comes into scrap where he finds some stability and the ability to help support his family. So these are just some of the stories that we share in this exhibit. We really enjoyed being able to explore and learn from all of these different scrappers from all over the Milwaukee area. And we hope that throughout the run of the exhibit, we get a time to hear more of their stories. Thanks so much for joining me today. As always, thanks to our supporter, Robin Cohen. You can come check out this exhibit Sunday through Friday. We're open. You can just walk in, or you can book your tickets online. We can't wait to see you. Thanks so much and have a wonderful day.